Chemicals. They can be quite promiscuous. They definitely get around, if you know what I mean. Point source versus non-point source pollution, of course. Point source pollution is when the pollution is coming from a specific place. It's very easy to track the direct application of the pollution into the environment. Non-point source pollution is a little bit more difficult. It comes from an area, not a single place. So, an example of both, with point source pollution, you're looking at things like sewage dumps. You're looking at like industrial complexes that have some runoff into rivers. While they are responsible for controlling the amount of pollution going into the river, there's still some pollution going in there, and we can absolutely say with certainty where that pollution is coming from. Non-point source is a little bit more difficult because it's usually like runoff. It's pollution that moves through the soil or water runoff or groundwater or moves through the air, and it spreads, it comes from a large area into an environment. So something like a farm. Like the pollution isn't coming from one particular part of the farm. It's coming from a huge area. Some farms are multi-acres. So like all of that, like say fertilizer that you dump onto the ground, that all slides and makes its way into the groundwater as it rains, and some of that fertilizer dissolves, goes down into the soil, and then it can make its way into rivers and other things. That is a non-point source of pollution, because it's not like we can't pinpoint exactly the spot that it's coming from. So pollutants can get around. They don't stay in one place. They either come from a specific spot or they come from a general area. But the main idea here, that and the big drive home that I need you to take, is that it can move from a spot, say an industrial complex, pumping out its crap up into the air. That crap can be a whole number of things: a little bit of ash, a little bit of like lead or mercury, other gases like carbon dioxide, or ground level ozone, like bad things going up into the air. We don't want those things up in the air. So these things, they don't stay in one place. Like as wind comes along, you get a gust of wind pushing things, and then this smoke, this ash, this whatever is going up into the air, it's going to spread itself out. It doesn't just go to one area, it spreads itself out over an area. Now, this is moving through the air. It's not where pollutants have to stay. Things like ash, lead, and mercury, like solids, they can make their way down to the ground. So let's get ourselves some nice green ground here. I'm going to do a little dip here, and I'll explain why in a bit. But these chemicals, like solids, can make their way to the ground. Cool. So if solids make their way to the ground, they come all the way down, and then there's a couple of different possible outcomes. One, those solids can make their way into a water source. So they can, from runoff, something called runoff, pollutants can run into the water, like that. So that adds the pollutants into the water system. That's a bad thing. So pollutants moving from the air to the soil to the water through runoff. But there's another possible way as well. Like solids, that's how they kind of make their way. They can also somewhat contaminate the soil, somewhat get in there. And then underneath the soil, is something called groundwater. There is a layer of water, which I'll label as actually a light blue. A layer of water underneath the ground that eventually meets up with the actual ground, with the actual water source. So something like a lake or a pond, fun fact that you might not know, a lake or a pond or a river is simply groundwater that is above ground. That's why I drew this little cutout. If you think of any lake or anything, it's groundwater. That's just the ground is so deep that it cuts into the groundwater. So we see the water above the surface. So anyway, here's the take home from this. Groundwater is connected to surface water. So these pollutants, as water, or sorry, let's add another component to this. Rain can come along. So rain droplets come along, and they can do a number of things. So rain can come along, and as the rain droplets come down through the smoke or the smog, the rain droplets can pick up along the way some of these pollutants. So that stuff that's in the air, some of that can dissolve into our rain droplets as it's coming, as the rain falls through this cloud of pollutant that's moving along. So the rain can carry like the gases. So the rain can dissolve gases from the air. So any of these gases like carbon dioxide and ozone, like other things, sulfur dioxide, things that cause acid rain, as the rain comes through it, it dissolves those gases into the rain, and then that rain eventually makes its way into the water source. So the rain comes down, carries with it the pollutants, and it adds those pollutants into our water source. So the light gray molecules also get in there. So the dissolved gases, the bad gases, it's not just the solids that make their way down. Eventually through rain, those dissolved gases can also make it into our water systems. Now, same thing, the rain can carry these dissolved gases, and not just the dissolved gases, it can sometimes pick up like little bits of ash as well, and bring that with it. So the rain is never pure. When you stick your tongue out and capture snowflakes on your tongue, rest assured you're also taking in a little tiny bit of pollution. So you got the dissolved gases coming in with the rain, and you also have your solids coming down. So the dissolved gases and the solids can make their way into the soil, which I suppose I didn't label here. You got your soil, and I suppose I should label this as our water. So these come in here, and then the rain does make its way down. It's called permeates. The rain permeates the soil and makes it to the groundwater. So this is another issue because you have rain carrying bad stuff. So the rain takes pollutants down to the groundwater. So that's one problem. And then another thing there is something called the leachate. So things, solids and other things can dissolve into the rain as it goes through the soil, which leaves us with an interesting predicament. This is called leachate. We end up with these chemicals all in our groundwater sources. So we have the solids that are carried down by the rain, we have the gases and other things that are carried down from the rain, and it pollutes our groundwater. Groundwater moves remarkably slowly. Sometimes, like around Fort McMurray, we've got there's a whole bunch of groundwater underneath the oil sands, and have a legitimate concern that some of the contaminants are making their way into the Athabasca River. And then communities downstream, like Fort McKay, Fort Chipewyan, are experiencing something pretty scary. Their cancer rates are really high, and that's been confirmed, that they have higher than normal cancer rates. And the types of cancer they have are caused by environmental pollutants. We are really concerned that we, over the last 30 years of having oil sands in and around Fort McMurray, we've been introducing chemicals into our groundwater. It's slowly made its way over decades into our river systems, and then those river systems are now contaminating the people downstream. So pollutants, they can move through the air, they can be brought from the air down to the ground. Solids and ash and stuff can slowly just make their way down, either landing directly on the soil or in the water. Rain can take those solids and bring them into the water, or it can carry them down through the soil, eventually making its way to the groundwater. No matter what, we end up with all of our systems along the bottom with pollutants in them. And I'm sure you can imagine many of these pollutants aren't good for us. So it all comes down to this is how chemicals move around in an environment, and we need to be really cognizant of what kind of stuff we're putting up into the air, because it comes back. It does not just disappear. So let's wrap up. Chemicals are not stationary. Like when they're introduced into environment, if they're spilled onto the ground, it would be very foolhardy to believe that whatever soil was spilled with that chemical, that's the area that's contaminated. That contamination can go so far from its original source. You have to be very aware of the groundwater systems and the wind currents. They can carry pollution pretty far from its original source. So speaking of sources, there's two types of sources. There are point sources, which are very specific locations, very known locations of where the pollutant is entering the environment. So from an industrial complex or some sort of sewage treatment plant, different things like that, we can pinpoint where that pollution is coming from. A non-point source is where it comes from a general area, like a farm. We know that pollution can come from a farm, particularly nutrients, like extra nutrient runoffs that can get into water and cause algae blooms. That would be a non-point source, because it's not one specific location, because farms can be acres, and several farms put together, the pollution could be coming from multiple farms. So a non-point source would be considering something that considering a pollutant that's coming from a big place where you can't just walk to one pipe and just shut off that one pipe and the pollution stops. You would have to do a lot more work with a non-point source to stop that pollution. So once pollution's in an environment, it can move around in three main places. It can move around in the air through wind currents. It can spread out through air currents. It can, from the air, it can either settle down onto the ground or onto the water, or when it rains, that rainwater can dissolve some of those chemicals from the air and drag them down to the ground or directly into lakes and rivers. Once it hits the soil, chemicals have a couple different places they can go. They can be absorbed by plants and animals right there in the soil, but they could also slowly make their way down to, that's called percolating, where those chemicals can make its way down into the groundwater. And then from there, groundwater very slowly moves towards open water sources. So eventually most contaminants make it into our water sources, and obviously we can't deal without that. So we need our fresh water, and we don't want pollutants in them, but that's kind of where all pollutants compile themselves. So pollutants, they get around, and we need to deal with that. It's an issue. Thanks for watching. Till next time.